This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hey guys, time to get in on the action for the biggest moments in basketball with PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projections, place your entry, and win up to 100 times your money. Right now, PrizePicks will match your first deposit of up to $100. Just download the PrizePicks app and use the code GET100. That's code GET100 on PrizePicks for a first deposit match of up to $100. PrizePicks. Pick more. Pick less. It's that easy.
Welcome to the XCast X-Files Podwatch, episode 18, covering Red Museum and Excelsis days. I'm your host, Darren Mooney, and with me is expert writer and artist Chris Knowles. How are you, Chris?
I'm doing great.
This is the first time we've actually had a chance to talk, because I've read a lot of your stuff online. I've obviously read the complete X-Files, and we've interacted a bit before through writing, but this is the first time I've actually had a chance to sort of talk with you. So this is actually a big thrill for me. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, like I said, I'm a huge Darren Mooney fan, so fan of your writing, fan of your podcasts, so pleasure is mutual.
Like, when it comes to the X-Files, we're both kind of interested in the mythology a great deal and sort of what Chris Carter did there. I think that when we talk about the first episode that we're going to talk about today, which is Red Museum, which aired on December the 9th, 1994, written by Chris Carter and directed by Wynn Phelps, which is the 10th episode of the second season. It's an interesting episode because it is, in some ways, it's a sort of mythology episode, but it's not really a mythology episode sort of coming off the Scully abduction. So, I mean, what are your impressions? What do you make of Red Museum?
I've heard and read a lot of people over the years say, Red Museum is confusing, it's convoluted. 2 points I want to make here. First of all, it really isn't, if you understand the through line. I mean, the story is about this town was singled out to test alien DNA injections on children and also in beef cattle. Like Scully says in the voiceover at the end, I mean, they use this cult as a control group. So all the twists
cult who don't eat meat, for example.
Yes, and what ends up happening is that there's a pedophile who's involved in this conspiracy who has a sort of a twinge of conscience, and he's trying, without exposing himself, to alert people to what is happening with these kids, because there's all this violence in the high school with the rapes and the things like that. So there's a lot of moving parts here. There are a lot of things sort of going on, but it's very true to life. This entire episode is all based on things that really happened in the United States, maybe still be happening. Human experimentation, organized pedophile rings,
even the mundane stuff like the beef injections and the protein
regulations. The beef injections,
modification of food, that sort of stuff.
That's very much an ongoing concern. The use of cults as intelligence fronts. Chris Carter is sort of working off a different data set than I think some of the fans might be necessarily cognizant of. So he's taking information that he's reading in the mainstream press, in the alternative press, in the underground press. He's taking all these themes, some of which were really starting to bubble up at that time, the whole thing with radiation experiments on pregnant women, on children, people in hospitals, the elderly, drug experimentations, all these things that were really going on. I mean, all this to me is like the most reality-based episode of the X-Files, probably of all. I mean, none of this stuff, except, the whole idea of when Mulder says, alien DNA. But Scully sort of countermands that by saying, that was never proven. What I've tried to stress about the X-Files is that it's based on point of view storytelling. So you're never actually sure what is going on, because everything you're seeing is meant to be seen from somebody's point of view, through somebody's biases, through somebody's, prejudices, through somebody's, experience. So when we hear this whole thing about alien DNA, which is really the only science fictional element in this entire episode, it may not necessarily, that just might be Mulder's belief. I mean, he's just sort of flying off the handle. Maybe in the real world, it's just some messed up genetic engineering experiment. So I am fascinated by this episode. It was originally meant to be a crossover with a show.
Picket Fences.
Yeah, which would have been a horrible idea. First of all, I apologize to anybody who liked that show, but I thought it was horrible. And I just think the blending of those flavors, it would be like sort of like vanilla ice cream with, absinthe. It just sounds good in theory, but probably you'd end up just throwing up, if you actually consume the two in combination. It just doesn't work. So I'm really happy that didn't happen. But I mean, like I said, this episode, this is reality-based conspiracy. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you would see like in the 70s.
Well, like the parallax view or that sort of thing as well. Like
exactly. It's that kind of storytelling that, we once saw and sort of dried up,
I would be of the mindset, like, I think you're right that it's not as complicated as most fans make it out. But my issue with it is that I think you're right when you say that there's perhaps too many moving parts in terms of like a story. But one of the things I like about it is that it's this sort of smorgasbord of things that you can tell that Carter is sort of interested in. And you mentioned the sort of the conspiracy aspect stuff, but even the broad social themes, like for example the idea of this small town that's this middle American small town, this quirky space like Twin Peaks and like picket fences, but this idea of a space that has been enclosed. And then you have, like, first of all, you have the Church of the Red Museum coming in, which they sort of reminds you of the stories you'd hear in the early 90s about like immigrants coming in who were vegetarians, like Hindu immigrants and that sort of stuff, East Asian immigrants and that sort of stuff, who would present a challenge to these communities. But also, even when they have the farmer who's talking to them about, like, it used to be that his father could raise a couple of cows on there and milk them and sell them as meat, but now everything has to be industrialized. There's no way that he can compete with that level of sort of production and capitalism and sort of product and sort of churn. And I mean, even the idea that's brought up repeatedly, you mentioned it there with the rapes in the school and the violence and the kids and stuff like that. That Carter in his work, he tends to come back to this idea of like evil as a corrupting force, but the idea that the world, like, there's a weird nostalgia, I think, to the way that the X-Files sort of looks at small towns in some respects and to small communities. And I think that, like, Red Museum sort of touches on some of that, and at the same time, you're right about like the paedophile rings and stuff like that, because it suggests that maybe the veneer of the small town isn't as idyllic as it initially seems, like, because you have the peeping Tom who's been making videos of the little boys. It's great that this show is able to get that past the radar, because it's very hard to imagine the 90s having a show that could get something that could make it very clear that this guy is a paedophile, basically, because that was sort of the thing you couldn't talk about on television, on primetime television. But you have this sort of sense of something evil lurking beneath this very American, very like relaxing, very sort of like idealized community. And I really like that aspect of Red Museum. I
totally agree with you. And this sort of plays into Carter's, I think his upbringing was a lot more troubled than he lets on. And I think he doesn't necessarily like to share it. And if you read between the lines, you sort of get the sense, problems, particularly problems that he had with his parents. I mean, he was living in the Long Beach area, which was experiencing deindustrialization at the time. So he has like a nostalgia for the way he saw the world before he realized that it wasn't the way he saw it, if that makes sense. And he has this nostalgia maybe for a world that he never actually lived in, that he read about but actually never really existed. And this is very common. I mean, I experience this in my own life. I mean, the town I grew up in, you wouldn't believe some of the things that went on that maybe most people weren't even aware of.
Or were willfully blind to,
or willfully blind to. It's more common than people realize that corruption, particularly in small towns, when it's easy for corrupt men to get together and take over a community. This is the kind of thing that this idealization of like small town values and, Americana and the Rust Belt and the Middle West, these things really are not reality based. They're based on an illusion that was created, but isn't necessary. And I think Carter, at this point in his life, is beginning to understand that. And I think this is what drives so much of the X-Files, is that him processing this idea that these idyllic communities are just fronts for something much deeper. I mean, and this might be something that he gets from Lynch. I mean, this is something that Lynch really put across in Blue Velvet. There's one point I want to make here, because this is a really interesting historical aside here. The Red Museum is actually, and this is a through line that sort of pops up in other seasons. But the Red Museum is based on a cult that was based in France and Canada called the Order of the Solar Temple. And the Order of the Solar Temple was very notorious for these mass suicides. And I think the Church of the Seven Stars in the fourth season is based on this as well. But there's an interesting historical footnote. So Carter is clearly basing the Church of the Red Museum on the Order of the Solar Temple. But at the same time, Marshall Applewhite and the Heaven's Gate cult, who became notorious a few years later, watched Red Museum and the whole idea of the walk-ins and the second souls and the first bodies and things like that. And they said, wait a minute, okay, that's us. They completely rewrote their entire
theology around
theology and cosmology around Red Museum. Because they watched that episode because they were sort of struggling and trying to figure out, why aren't the UFOs landing, blah, 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 blah. And then they realized, like, oh, wait, we are the aliens. We are aliens inhabiting human bodies. And the X-Files is telling us, they're giving us this message. Unfortunately, it had very unfortunate consequences. But this is where we are. This is where we are now, that the bleed over between pop culture and consensus reality is really starting to, we have a reality show host as president now. It's the lines of demarcation are definitely dissolving at this point in time between reality and non-reality.
Yeah, there is no, people can't agree on what's real and what's not anymore. It's terrifying, and it's interesting to watch the X-Files as a cultural artifact. Sorry, I feel like we're going on tangents upon tangents, but it's a testament to how interesting the episode is. But that you get this level of abstraction almost. You can see it, the X-Files in some respects feels like you're watching Carter deal with that and process with that and sort of pull it apart. You can almost see the unboxing of reality, through the prism of sort of 70s paranoia that will lead to where we are now, which is, 20 years before you had the 70s, then you have the 90s, and then 20 years later you have roughly where we are now. And you can sort of see the X-Files as sort of a point in that journey away from what you call consensus reality towards this sort of weird reality TV show that we seem to be living in.
Well, people were commenting on this in the 70s, by the way. The show, the film network, or being there. This process is not novel to the 90s, is what I'm trying to say. This was already, Marshall McLuhan. These are things that were already starting to, maybe in a more rarefied and intellectual fashion, but now, we're sort of getting the hand-me-down version of it now. But, the thing, I know that, yourself, Carl, Tony, and I, and others, we sort of appreciate Chris Carter's writing more than I think a lot of other fans do. And I think that's a byproduct of the fact that I think he maybe injects more, thematic elements and real world elements and things of that nature into his scripts than, say, you might see in DPO or in,
Then say narrative or the stock criticisms I think of Carter's scripts are perhaps that, his dialogue is perhaps a little sort of purple prosy, which I think works very well in some cases, or that, his narratives aren't necessarily perfectly outlined and sort of point by point linear and easier to follow. What I like about Carter, I think you're right, is that he's just he's a brilliant thematic writer, and he's very good at he's got this, it's like a blender. Carter's writing seems to be like a blender where he puts all of his fears, all of his anxieties, all of his concerns, all the things that interest him into it, and he sort of just whooshes them around and lets them bounce off one another. And the results are always fascinating, I would argue, but are occasionally more than occasionally, are sublime.
And I would sort of mark this episode in the latter category. It is incredibly complex, but it works, particularly if you're aware with the source material. And in some ways, it's sort of like one of the last episodes where you really got clean dialogue from Carter, where you got naturalistic dialogue from him. And I think with the introduction of the Syndicate, and as we sort of move on into that next phase of the series, the writing tends to be a little bit more self-conscious, a little bit more
abstract almost.
Yeah, I mean, it reads more like an editorial sometimes than human speech. It tends to be, and I think this is a point where he goes, all right, I exhausted the Kolchak the Night Stalker inspiration, and now I'm going to move forward, with my all the President's Men type of inspirations. And
yeah, this is a statement of theme. This is a statement of purpose. This is, this is exposition almost, but it's thematic exposition rather than, dialogue.
His best naturalistic dialogue writing, let's say, I think, is in that first, 30 episodes or so, that batch. But anyway, so that's how I feel about Red Museum.
All right, so having talked about Red Museum, what are your feelings on Excelsis Day, which was the 11th episode of the 10th season, unsurprisingly coming after the 10th, directed by Steven Surgic, written by Paul Brown, and originally aired on December the 16th, 1994. So right before Christmas, a nice big treat.
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why Paul Brown left the show, because apparently the script came in and it was unproducible and it had to be rewritten. And from what I've been told, I mean, Carter was actually writing scenes for this episode just before they needed to be shot. That this was a real rescue operation, salvage operation. They were really flying by the seat of their pants here. And you sort of get the sense, if you understand that this started off as one thing and then became a Chris Carter script, it makes a lot more sense to you, because here we see the hallucinogens, which we just saw, the episode before in Red Museum, that theme popping up again. And of course would show up with a little less dramatic impact in the 10th season. But anyhow.
Well, I mean, one of the things actually that, your writing, like I mentioned at the start, I'm a huge fan of your writing. And one of the things about your writing that really grabbed me, that really sort of maybe opened my eyes to the X-Files and go, how the hell did I miss something so obvious, is the fact that you point out that hallucinogens are this big recurring theme that sort of run throughout the show, to the point where, when you talk about Babylon, when you talk about the 10th season, penultimate episode, that's a I never would have twigged this, but you pointed out on The Secret Son that basically it's a recurring motif where you have the penultimate episode of the season dealing with these out-of-body hallucinogenic experiences. And I think that's phenomenal. That is a big core X-Files theme that many people, myself included, would never have picked up on.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm glad you have picked up on that. It certainly is a recurrent motif throughout the series. And the other thing I pointed out is how they would twin a standalone dealing with hallucinogens with a mythology episode. It's a very subtle suggestion, inference that really it's all about the same. It's all about the same phenomena. Carter was a surfer in Southern California. I don't know if I need to elaborate on that, but
I for the purposes of our lawyers, we probably won't ask you to. But
yeah, I mean, hallucinogens were basically the staff of life to that subculture. I mean, he's growing up in the post hippie era, the post 60s era, but acid and mushrooms, angel dust. I mean, you name it. And they're less remarked upon. They're less a news story, but they've gone from these sort of enclaves in Los Angeles and San Francisco and New York and London to basically, all over the entire country, to pretty disastrous effect in very many cases. But it goes from this sort of elite bohemian, interest to something that high school kids were doing. So he's growing up at the time where you have the hangover from the 60s, you have the disillusionment, you have the Watergate era. I mean, it's kind of grim, and hallucinogens are basically everywhere. So you can look at the X-Files not only as sort of a chronicle of late boomers, early Gen X and their response to these social convulsions, these social and political convulsions. But you can also see it almost as like a time capsule of the influences on that cohort. I mean, Carter's sort of the advanced guard. I mean, 56, I mean, it's a little early, this cohort I'm talking about, but it's influenced by the same thing. I mean, where you see like, X songs or, Black Flag songs show up in Millennium. I mean, just these kind of influences. So I'm talking about this cohort of late boomers, early Gen Xers that are really coming to their own in the early 90s. But, straddling that period is Dwight D. Eisenhower's famous military-industrial complex speech.
Warns about the next 50
years.
years,
He tells you exactly and if you watch him, if you look at his demeanor and his expression, that is not a man who has a great deal of optimism or hope for what's coming down the pike. And then, you see the National Security Act, and you see the creation of the CIA, and then you see, all the mind control programs, MK Search, Artichoke, MK Ultra, Bluebird. I mean, just a series, one after another, of human experiments in mental hospitals. I mean,
prisoners, even on non-consenting adults, the radiation trials, for example, like that sort of stuff. But that's the striking thing about the X-Files, is that so much of it actually happened, and not like in a conspiracy tinfoil hat sort of like crazy way, in like an actual documented proof release, like actual release government papers explaining that you did these experiments with LSD on people, you actually smuggled Nazis across, you tried to do remote viewing, like it's objectively verifiable, like and even the more outlandish stuff, if you stripped out the aliens, a lot of the stuff in the X-Files is like a reflection of America after the Second World War.
That's exactly right. And with these mind control programs, and there's a reason why you have this subplot with drug trials on the elderly, and the elderly consuming hallucinogenic mushrooms and things like this, because these things really happen. They're documented, they're recorded. This is accepted history. I mean, you can go onto the CIA's website and read about all this stuff yourself if you don't believe it. But they seem to really like nursing homes, mental hospitals, state schools for, mentally handicapped kids. What I believe we're seeing in Excelsis DEA is the second part of Red Museum, because these MK Ultra mind control experiments, where people were given massive doses of LSD, they happened in Worcester, where Excelsis DEA is set. I mean, they happened all over the country, but they happened in Worcester. There were actually two separate institutions in Worcester that were carrying out these experiments. It was the Worcester State Hospital and I forget the exact name of it. It was like the Worcester Institute for Public Health. This stuff really happened. So I think what Carter is doing is that he's got this dumb ghost story that takes place in a nursing home, and he's like, this is weak. I seem to remember that Morgan and Wong especially hated the original script, and like it had to be rewritten. So in order to sort of tie it into the X-Files milieu, the X-Files universe, I mean, Carter is dipping back into the same well that he had just dipped into with Red Museum, and doing so with Excelsis DEA. And I think that the interesting factor that sort of conjoins these two episodes, besides this real life, really bad, real life Nazi experiments that took place in the United States, is this whole idea that, the salvage job. So like when Carter is under the gun and he's sort of put to the test,
well, you grab whatever's to hand. Like, cause, I mean, this is the thing about TV production, is that you have to have a page in front of the actors because you can't hold up production. So, like, you were talking about, like, this situation being where you're writing it and literally sending it down to the actors to perform on the morning in question. When you're writing that, you're pretty much automatic writing at that stage. It's just like, whatever's in my head is coming out on the page.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like when he's under the gun and he's got to produce, I mean, this is where his head goes to, which I find, a sort of a fascinating character facet of Chris Carter.
All right, well, with that in mind, then, I think we're sort of wrapped up on these two episodes. But Chris, just in case people are listening and want to find you, well, first of all, you wrote the complete X-Files, and I believe that is also that got a re-release recently as well.
It did.
So perfect. You can check that out on Amazon or wherever good books are sold, really. But I mean, if people want to check you out online,
just go to secretsun.blogspot.com.
Perfect. you can find me online at the Movie Blog. I host a movie podcast, 250, and I also have my own X-Files book, which, to be honest, is very much indebted to Chris's work. So you could probably get it with a bit of luck, myself and Chris will be back at some point in the near or not too distant future to talk about another couple of episodes. But until then, remember, trust no one.